which he could have never possibly figured out to make a 180-degree turn and head back to New York 90 miles and find New York. It's not like he can just look around the horizon and find New York. You can't see it from 90 miles. So he has to figure out how to navigate to get there, and then he has to figure out how to make the turn and make the descent into the building. Now, the speeds that everybody says, and when I say everybody, the government and NASA and everybody, is 560 miles an hour. That's impossible for a Boeing 767. Its maximum speed is 360 knots. If you go any faster than that, parts are going to start coming off, and it's going to be unable to fly. Now, the Boeing 67 in flight test has flown up to 420 knots, but that's under very, very special conditions, and a hijacker would not be able to fly it under those very special conditions. And he certainly wouldn't be able to fly it 50 knots faster, which would be 470 knots. That's about 560 miles an hour. That's impossible. It cannot happen aerodynamically, and it cannot happen in real life. So all that speed stuff was fake. But to be able to hit a building at 800 feet altitude and hit it dead center is equally impossible.
Why?
All of this done was with holographic projections, and there was probably a few controlled demolitions in the basement, but most of the damage was done by the weaponized satellites that the Navy controls.
How come you can talk about it without fear?
Because I don't reach that big an audience. It's not like I was on Larry King or anything like that. They don't bother me if I talk about it with, say, an audience of 50 or 60 or 100. That doesn't bother them. It's not a threat.
Is it not a threat because, for the most part, the average person wouldn't allow it in their consciousness for contemplation?
Right. They just couldn't believe it.
Talk to us about why hitting the building dead center is just ridiculous.
Well, it's only 208 feet wide. And even the most proficient pilot, at the top of my proficiency, at the end of my career, as good as I was, I couldn't have hit it. You're just going too fast to be able to hit something 208 feet wide, dead center. You just can't do it. You're going too fast.
What if it was only going 300 miles per hour?
You might get a little closer. Sure.
What if they say, well, the radar got it wrong. It wasn't 575 miles per hour. It was only 300.
300 miles an hour, you might be able to do it. Yeah, you might be able to do it. But, hitting it dead center, the fact is no part of any kind was ever found in or near either of the buildings. There was an engine that came off a 747. It was actually the turbine part of the engine, and that was found on Murray Street. But that was not an engine that came off United 175, which was the one that crashed into the South Tower. Each airplane, a Boeing 767, has about 3 million parts, and all of these parts are labeled. They all have to have a PMA, which is a Parts Manufacturer Authority number on it, either stamped or written or embossed in some way. None of those parts were found or identified. And then you have two massive engines that normally take temperatures of 800 degrees centigrade or hotter, and they just cannot disappear. It's not possible. All we had was a fuel fire. JP4 doesn't burn that hot. And it was out in about 2 or 3 minutes, so there was nothing to propagate or make the fire intensify. It had to be done someplace else, and there was no parts identified, and people say, well, maybe they cleaned it all up. Okay, well, if I was doing this cover-up, I would have certainly been delighted to load an engine on a truck from all the debris and say, here it is, here's the engine of the airplane, we got it, but they didn't. All there was just a little bit of steel, and that was hauled out in about 3 or 4 days.
How come people say they saw airplanes? Are you saying that is the holographic projection?
That is the hologram. And there's 41 videos, and all of those videos are holograms.
Amazing. Which tells us then that this technology is so advanced that it's probably used for warfare, right?
Yes, it was developed and operational about 20 years ago. It is used for warfare all the time. It's standard in the military operation. They use it all the time. Also, they use the weaponized satellites all the time, but you're not going to hear about it.
What are you doing with Truth for 9/11 Pilots? What is happening with that organization?
I'm just a core member, which means one of the first members of Pilots for Truth on 9/11, and they do a lot of excellent work on the Pentagon, and I just support what they're doing.
You're all very brave to be talking about it.
They have some videos that are just outstanding which prove some of the things I'm talking about. In Flight 77, I was the one that discovered that when they started to descend, that it was the only flight recorder data released by the FBI and the National Transportation Safety Board. One of the interesting things that I found is I know how to read digital flight recorder outputs. There's 156 parameters that they read, and they read it 8 times a second. And it comes in a roll, and you can put it on your computer and start reading all this. Well, one of the things I went for first was to look at some of the things that happened when they descended. Now, when they descended at 18,000 feet, that's when you go from standard barometric pressure of 2,992 inches of mercury to the local barometric setting. And it appears that from the digital flight recorder that the co-pilot set his first, and then the pilot set his about 30 seconds later to the local barometric pressure. Now, there's 2 things wrong with that. Number one, there was no co-pilot. Hani Hanjour was the only pilot flying, and why would he undo his seatbelt and reach way over to the co-pilot's altimeter and reset it, and then reset his? And then the second question is, how in the heck did he know what the barometric pressure of Ronald Reagan International Airport was in the first place? He wasn't talking to anybody. There's no recordings of him calling air traffic control and asking for the barometric pressure. And why would he need the barometric pressure anyway? He was going to crash. He doesn't need to know the exact altitude he is off the ground. Setting the local barometric pressure is for instrument approaches when you have to know exactly how many feet you are above the ground. So that was the first mistake they made. Then the next mistake they made was they didn't know that there's a third hidden altimeter off which the digital flight recorder records its altitude information, and it's set to 2,992. For the people that were trying to fake all this, use that altitude for hitting the Pentagon. Well, the problem is the actual barometric pressure at Ronald Reagan International was 30.11 or 30.21, and if you extrapolate that, you'll find that the airplane actually overflew the Pentagon by 300 feet. But the people that pulled this off didn't know that little tiny detail. They were taking the readings off the pilot's altimeter. So that proves that the airplane overflew. We have April Gallup, who was an Army intelligence officer who was sitting 40 feet away. Her desk was 40 feet away from the hole, and she said there was an explosion. She saw no airplane, no drone, no nothing of any kind, smelled no fuel, no gas, no jet fuel, no JP-7, no JP-4, no nothing. And she picked up her 6-month-old son, who was sitting in a baby carrier below her seat, and she climbed out that hole, and she went over onto the grass for triage treatment, where they treat you for injuries.
Okay.
And she won't change her story, and the Army has harassed her for the last 8 or 10 years.
And what is she doing now?
I don't know. I haven't kept up with it.
Wow, this is really heavy. It's really, really heavy. What happens to all these pilots who come forth to talk about it the way you talk about it? Are they still flying? Have they been dismissed? Are they retired?
Nobody usually talks about it. There's a lot of pilots that joined Pilots for Truth, but they don't do a lot of talking about it because they're dependent on their jobs. Pretty much everybody knows that the truth will probably never come out. And although there are people that are really trying to get the truth out, it's very difficult to happen. I was part of the suit against the 23 companies that participated in this, all located in New Mexico and New York, and it was called a quid-am complaint filed by Morgan Reynolds. It was suing those 23 companies for their participation in 9/11, and I wrote an affidavit and submitted it to the New York District Court to prove, it was a 15-page affidavit, which proves scientifically and mathematically that an airplane could not go that fast, and to prove that there was no airplanes in the first place. But it was dismissed in July of 2009, I think it was. It was just summarily dismissed. They didn't read it at all. It was just dismissed from the court. So, you know, they have the secret government, or whoever runs this has control of everybody. They have control of the courts, the government, and the whole thing.
I don't even know where to go from there.
Well, let me tell you. People will say, now, so what do we do? And I say the only thing you can do, and the only thing you should do, is worry about yourself. Don't worry about the other guy. Don't worry about 9/11. Don't worry about the starving people in Africa. Don't worry about the killings in Afghanistan and Iraq.